Welcome to this week's edition of Ask an MS Expert. I'm Jon Strum, and I'm the host of the Real Talk MS podcast. Each week, Real Talk MS reaches thousands of people in more than 100 countries around the world with the news that people affected by MS need to know. My wife, Jean, lived with progressive MS for 23 years, so I've had a front row seat experiencing all the ways that MS can impact a family. I'm a past member of the International Progressive MS Alliance Scientific Steering Committee, and currently I'm a district activist leader and trustee for the National MS Society, and I chair the Society's California Government Relations Advisory Committee. The MS Society's Ask an MS Expert webcast is designed to give us a place for the MS community to connect and to connect you with the MS experts who are ready to answer your questions on the topics that impact people living with MS every day. Please feel free to post your comments and questions on Facebook, YouTube, or Twitch. MS navigators are online throughout today's program, answering your questions and connecting you to resources. Recent research published in the journal Science by a team at Harvard provides the strongest evidence yet for the role of the Epstein-Barr virus in triggering multiple sclerosis. Dr. Bruce Bebo, the Executive Vice President of Research at the National MS Society, is joining us today to talk about the impact of this research breakthrough on the MS community and what the MS Society plans to do with this new information. Welcome, Bruce. Thanks for being with us today.
Hi, John. Good to be with you. Looking forward to it.
We've been talking about this connection between the Epstein-Barr virus, or EBV, and MS for quite a while now, so this discovery is really exciting. The study results show that EBV is the leading cause of multiple sclerosis. So can we definitively say EBV causes MS?
Well, let's dig into that a little bit. So Epstein-Barr virus, or EBV, is a highly prevalent virus. By adulthood, about 95% of us show evidence that we've been infected with EBV. And this is a virus that lives inside of most of us. It lives inside of us for all of our lives. And in most cases, it doesn't cause any harm. Most people are infected with EBV when they're very young, a time when it usually, again, doesn't cause any symptoms. But if you get infected during adolescence or early adulthood, it can sometimes cause symptoms. It can cause a disease about 30 to 50% of the time, a disease called mononucleosis, sometimes called glandular fever. And this is, and there's overwhelming evidence that there's an association between mononucleosis caused by EBV infection and MS. And this association between MS and EBV and mono, it's important to remember that that doesn't necessarily mean that MS is caused by EBV. So let's look at this illustration, John, to kind of try to understand the differences between associations and causations. So there are a number of clues that we're going to need to be able to show causation. So the first clue is that the infection, the event, whatever it might be, in this case, the infection with EBV, it needs to come before the onset of MS, right? It can't really be a cause if it comes after. So that's one piece of the puzzle. We also have to eliminate the possibility that there's some confounding factor, like that's illustrated in this slide, right? There's an association between eating ice cream and sunburn, but sunburn doesn't cause you to eat ice cream or the other way around. And so you got to make sure that there isn't some other confounding factor that is contributing to the association. And you need to also eliminate this concept of reverse causality. So in this case, does EBV cause MS, or does having MS or being at high risk for MS cause you to get mono? And so you have to eliminate that possibility. And then finally, the clue you need to show definitively causation, of course, is that if you prevent infection, that you, and in this case, prevent infection with EBV, that you can prevent MS. So the article that you talked about, John, in Science, in extremely well done study by a highly respected group, what they showed was that the infection with EBV precedes, it comes before any evidence of MS. And it also showed that it's highly unlikely that being at risk for MS also makes one more susceptible to EBV. So it's just a strong argument against this reverse causation. So I would say that we're a lot closer to proving causation. And of course, the one piece of the puzzle left is to show that preventing EBV can prevent MS. And so I borrowed this slide, John, that help us illustrate this a little bit. I borrowed this from our colleague, Gavin Giovannoni. I hope this helps understand really the implications for the study. So while we don't know the exact cause of MS, over the last several decades, a number of factors, including mononucleosis, have been associated with the increased risk for MS. And many of you have heard these already. There's a role for genetics. For example, we know that if you have a close relative with MS, your risk is higher for developing MS. We know things like low levels of vitamin D, childhood obesity, and smoking are contributing risk factors for MS. And so these all, in combination with Epstein-Barr virus and infectious mononucleosis, are all contributing factors. And I'd say from this study, John, based on the really very strong risk that EBV seems to add to this equation, it's really pretty likely that this is a necessary and a key factor that contributes to the cause of MS. And like it's illustrated on the slide, like a string of dominoes, if we can take out one or more of these really critical risk factors, we can keep the rest of the dominoes from falling, and we can potentially prevent MS from happening in the first place.
I heard you say that about 95% of our population has or is carrying EBV. How is it transmitted?
Yeah. So EBV virus is in the herpes virus family. It's related to viruses that cause chickenpox and herpes infections, and it's transmitted primarily through saliva. And as I mentioned, more than 95% of the human population has been infected with EBV. And this virus, it infects the immune system, and it persists in a latent form in immune cells called B cells, and they live there the virus lives there for the rest of your life. And in addition to being a trigger for MS, it's also associated, this virus is associated with a higher risk for some blood cancers. It's estimated that EBV infection accounts for about 200,000 new cancer cases and accounts for about 150,000 deaths a year worldwide. And in addition to this, our increasing understanding of the involvement of EBV and the risk for MS, there's evidence that EBV contributes to the risk of some other autoimmune diseases like lupus, rheumatoid arthritis, and Sjogren's syndrome.
You know, I'm thinking back to the beginning of the current pandemic that we find ourselves in. Before there were any safe and effective vaccines as there are available today, what health professionals were recommending is if you want to avoid the COVID, the novel coronavirus, you would practice social distancing and wear a mask. And it made me wonder, is there a way to avoid getting EBV?
I would say, John, not really. There's not really a practical way to avoid becoming infected. Maybe, just never kiss anybody. Maybe that would be one way to do it, but I don't think that that's practical. I think, our best hope is a vaccine. I think that's the best way we're going to prevent infection.
And to that point, I know clinical trials for an EBV vaccine are underway. How close are we to testing an EBV vaccine in people with MS?
Yeah, so research and testing of experimental vaccines for EBV have been underway for decades, really. This virus is complex. It has a complex life cycle, and there aren't any animal models for this infection. So progress in the development of vaccines has been slower than we would like, and certainly slower than what we saw for other viruses like the virus that causes COVID. But we're getting closer. We're getting closer to safe and effective vaccines for EBV. Recently, a vaccine was shown to significantly reduce the incidence of mononucleosis. It doesn't prevent infection, but it does prevent the mononucleosis. And some scientists think maybe that'll be enough. That could potentially be enough to prevent at least some cases of MS. And there are new vaccines being tested. Perhaps many of you have seen already that about a first-in-human trial of a vaccine developed, an mRNA vaccine developed by Moderna for EBV. That's in an early phase clinical trial. So there's progress being made, and I think there's one should be optimistic that we may have a safe and effective vaccine in the near future.
And could an EBV vaccine prevent someone from getting MS?
Yeah, I think that's a real possibility, John. But of course, the only way to prove it would be to conduct a clinical trial, and as you could imagine, that is a little bit tricky. But the society has been consulting with global experts to explore different concepts, approaches for an MS prevention trial, so that once we have a safe and effective vaccine, we'll be ready to test it in an MS prevention trial in an expedited way.
Just curious, did the National MS Society participate in funding this study at Harvard? And will the society continue funding research into the cause of MS?
Yeah, so the society did help fund part of the study, and specifically, we funded some of the experiments that were published in the work that provided evidence that the virus contributes to MS risk rather than the other way around. So the parts of the study that helped create a case against reverse causation were funded by the society. I think, in my opinion, that was one of the most important observations in the paper. And we've been funding research into triggers and risk factors for MS for decades. We've invested millions of dollars specifically in elucidating the role of EBV in MS. And prevention of MS is one of the pillars of our Pathways to Cures research roadmap initiative. And we will be prioritizing research that provides insights into how we might be able to prevent MS, including vaccine for EBV.
We heard from Brent. He shared with us that he's had some muscle and joint issues a year ago. So he had some blood tests done and found that he was positive for the Epstein-Barr virus. Brent says he's never had mononucleosis. He has no history of MS in his family, and he's wondering whether everyone who contracts the Epstein-Barr virus gets MS.
Right. Well, so as we discussed previously, by adulthood, somewhere on the order of 95% of us have been infected with EBV. And in most cases, people don't even know it. So no, the vast majority of people with EBV do not get MS. What we do know is that if you get EBV as a teenager or young adult, and it's symptomatic, right? You get this mononucleosis, your risk for MS is higher than if you got EBV as an infant or a child. But again, only really a very small proportion of even of the people who get mono go on to develop MS.
We heard from Jada, who says she's been living with MS for 20 years, and she wants us to know that she finds the study results really promising for the future. She's wondering whether the study offers any sort of benefit for people who are currently living with MS.
So I guess I would say not specifically related to this study, but there are other studies and ongoing studies determine whether MS might actually be a consequence of ongoing EBV infection. Some have in the context of COVID, considered this or thinking of this as a long-term consequence, rare consequence of EBV infection. And that remains a possibility. The virus likes to hide and sometimes affects the function of immune B cells. And we know B cells play an important role in MS. There are ongoing clinical trials testing cell-based approaches that target EBV-infected B cells, and early results are promising. And I expect this and other studies might also inspire testing of perhaps, John, antiviral drugs or other approaches for treating EBV infection and potentially having some influence or role in reducing ongoing MS.
Does this study from Harvard show whether EBV causes MS relapses, progression?
Sure. So no, that this study, again, specifically the study doesn't address that question, but I'd say it's plausible for the reasons that I mentioned, that EBV infects B cells, and we know B cells have an important role to play in MS. Some of our very good disease-modifying therapies are targeting those cells. So it's certainly plausible that EBV-infected cells are playing a role in ongoing disease. Another concept, John, a way that EBV might be playing a role in triggering, causing MS is this concept called molecular mimicry. So the idea is that the virus expresses proteins, receptors on its surface that look like proteins and receptors that are expressed by the nervous system, and accidentally cause the immune system to react to the nervous system. That's another concept. And additional knowledge that could be used to potentially help develop therapies, approaches for treating ongoing disease.
You know, I'm thinking about the picture of the dominoes he showed us a moment ago, and seeing how if we can knock out that EBV domino, it prevents MS from developing at the end of all those dominoes. Well, Jada asked a question that's a little different than that. She's wondering whether a treatment for EBV might help to cure people who are already living with MS.
Yeah, I think that's plausible. And there are, again, cell-based therapies and pharmaceutical approaches, perhaps an antiviral approach, John, that might be able to at least improve and potentially cure MS. And there are ongoing studies, of course, to test those ideas.
We heard from Ashley, who says she doesn't have MS, but when she was a teenager, she did have mononucleosis, which, as you pointed out, is caused by the Epstein-Barr virus. She also wants us to know that her grandmother is living with MS. And Ashley's concerned that based on the news about EBV and MS and her genetics, she's worried that she's going to develop MS. And she wants to know whether there's any sort of test or screening that she can have done to see whether she could develop MS.
Yeah, so not yet. But this is an area of active investigation, and I'm optimistic. I'm optimistic that we may be able to determine who's at high risk for MS, and determine that with enough confidence that we could begin a treatment prior even to the onset of symptoms, and significantly delay or maybe even prevent MS. And we recently funded more than a dozen new projects in this area of research. And I guess, John, the other thing I would say is I would advise Ashley to be on the lookout for neurological symptoms, symptoms that might suggest some of the early signs of MS. So things like vision problems, and I would encourage everyone who's concerned about the risk for MS to have an annual eye exam. Things like sensory issues, numbness, tingling, balance problems, et cetera. These sort of symptoms that suggest a neurological issue, I would encourage people who may be at a little higher risk than the general population, like Ashley, to be on the eye for those symptoms, pun kind of intended, and report those symptoms to your healthcare provider and follow up on them, because they could be early indications of MS.
Well, that's great advice. You know, now that we have this scientific consensus, what's the National MS Society going to do with this new information?
Right. So as I mentioned before, supporting research in MS prevention is a key part of our Pathways to Cures research initiative. And we already have plans to make targeted research investments in this really promising area of research. And as I mentioned before, we've already made recent and new investments that build upon previous work in this area of investigation. We have up to now received the endorsement of over 20 global MS organizations on this Pathways to Cures research roadmap. So there's already global consensus that, among other areas, targeting research in MS prevention is a high priority. And this study and others provide more clues and more guidance about where to focus new research investments. And because of the increased global leadership the society has taken in accelerating the development of treatments for progressive MS through the International Progressive MS Alliance, and also the consensus that we've built around pathways to cures, I'm more confident than ever that we will be able to inspire the other funders, other members of the MS movement to join us in a coordinated effort to fully understand the implications of this study, understand the implications for MS prevention, and be positioned to test promising prevention strategies, maybe even including an EBV vaccine in the near future.
Well, I want to thank you for helping us better understand the relationship between EBV and MS and for putting these new study results into context for us. Bruce, what would you say are the top 3 takeaways that you'd like our audience to remember today?
Yeah, so the first is that we are closer than we ever have been to identifying and understanding the triggers and risk factors for MS. That knowledge is going to lead to prevention and treatment strategies that can be tested and will be tested in the next few years in clinical trials. And then my third point, John, is really that there are early warning signs of MS. As I mentioned, problems with vision or balance and walking, numbness, tingling, things like that. And that if you have a close relative with MS, maybe you're a woman and maybe you had mono as a teenager, or you're a smoker. Those are all risk factors that I think would indicate that you really should be on high alert for those early symptoms and report them to your healthcare provider as soon as possible and see a neurologist as soon as possible. And that way we could potentially identify people very, very early on in their journey with MS. And we know the earlier we diagnose MS and the earlier we start treating it with an effective disease-modifying therapy, the better the long-term outcomes are going to be.
I think we have time for 1 or 2 more questions. We got one from Maggie that is interesting. She wants to know whether it's possible to have MS but not have EBV.
Yeah, that's a great question. It's extremely unlikely. So remember, we said it many times now that 95% of the population has evidence for EBV. Well, up to now, 100% of people with MS have shown evidence of EBV. Now, that there is now one exception. The science paper that we were talking about, John, today did have one case of MS without any evidence up to now of an EBV infection. As far, to the best of my knowledge, that's the first case ever in history of MS without evidence of EBV. But up to that case, there's been no evidence of MS without exposure to EBV.
And we heard from Angel, who's wondering, how do you find out if you have EBV? Is there a test for it?
Yeah, you can get a test for it, John. I'm not sure there's a lot of value in being tested for it. Again, you can assume since 95% of the population has evidence for EBV that you've had it, and there really isn't any actionable, I don't think, from the knowledge of that you had it or not. I'd say the key knowledge that might be helpful for people at risk for MS is whether they had mono or not. That's probably more important than knowing whether you're infected with EBV or not.
Well, I want to thank everyone who submitted some great questions today, and thanks for being with us, Bruce. Before we close, I want to remind you that the National MS Society's MS Navigator team is your best partner when it comes to connecting you to the very best information and resources on living with MS. You can reach an MS Navigator by phone, email, or through the Society's website by chat. For information and resources on MS, please visit the Society's website. You'll find research updates and news, information on connection programs like self-help groups and MS Friends, ways for you to get involved, and information about events taking place near you. Remember, you can connect with the National MS Society and others affected by MS on Facebook, Instagram, Twitter, YouTube, and LinkedIn. And I hope you'll join me every week on the Real Talk MS podcast, where I continue the conversation that we start here. You'll find Real Talk MS at realtalkms.com, Apple Podcasts, Google Podcasts, Spotify, Amazon Music, or wherever you find your favorite podcasts. I'd like to thank Dr. Bruce Bebo for joining us today. Please remember that a recording of this webinar is going to be available at the Society's website at nationalmssociety.org/MSExpert, as well as on Facebook and YouTube. I hope you'll join us at this same time for next week's edition of Ask an MS Expert. You can always find our upcoming program topics on the National MS Society's website. And now I have a favor to ask each of you. Getting your feedback on today's program is important. So you'll see a survey pop up in a moment when we close out the webinar. And if you're watching on Facebook Live, you'll see a link to that survey pinned to the comments section. And on YouTube, you'll find that link in the program description. Completing this survey makes a real difference. The information you provide helps us continuously improve, and it helps shape future webinars. The survey takes just 1 minute. So I hope you'll take a minute and please fill it out. On behalf of Dr. Bruce Bebo and the National MS Society, I want to thank you once again for joining us. Please stay safe and make healthy choices.